In an old house on the night before Christmas, we heard an unusual story. Gathered by the fire, someone remarked it was the first time they'd heard of a child seeing a ghost. Douglas, sensing the curiosity, shared that it wasn't a unique occurrence. There were other instances of children witnessing ghosts. The conversation pivoted to the anticipation of a story that had a sinister reputation. Although Douglas wished to start immediately, the story was locked away in a book at his home. Eagerly, we requested him to expedite getting the book, and he agreed. The tale came from a woman, Douglas's sister's governess, who documented it before her demise. It is about a young governess hired to care for 2 children in London by their handsome and wealthy uncle, who became her object of affection. The mysterious death of the previous governess left the new one questioning her ability to care for the children, leading to her journey of promises and challenges. Later, the boy, Miles, arrived. I inquired about the previous governess and learned she was young and pretty but perhaps not careful with everything. She died during a holiday. Miles, as beautiful as his sister Flora, seemed innocent. The school claimed he couldn't return, deeming him dangerous. Disturbed, I decided not to respond to the letter or discuss it with Miles. Mrs. Gross and I became friends to the children. Mrs. Gross assured me she wouldn't answer the letter, and together, we'd support the children. I spent weeks enjoying the children's company, teaching them and learning to be free. One evening, I saw a mysterious man on the tower's roof, but he vanished, leaving me confused. As days passed, I saw his face again, this time at the window. It was Quint, the master's deceased servant, dressed in the master's clothes. Mrs. Gross revealed Quint's death, leaving me disturbed and frightened for the safety of the children. Mrs. Gross and I discussed Quint's ghost extensively. She had never seen anything, but she believed my story. I revealed that Quint's ghost was looking for little Miles, and Mrs. Gross grew alarmed. We concluded that Quint was dangerous and wanted to find the children. Miles never spoke about Quint, indicating their close friendship. Mrs. Gross disclosed that Quint and Miss Jessel were lovers, and Quint's influence on Miles was inappropriate. Both Quint and Miss Jessel suffered tragic fates. Mrs. Gross and I realized we couldn't save the children. One day, I took Flora to the lake, where we encountered Miss Jessel's ghost. Flora saw her too, but neither of us spoke of it. Mrs. Gross explained Quint's death, and we shared a moment of sorrow. However, I still yearned to be with the children, especially Flora, who remained innocent despite the dreadful truth. Concerning Miles, Mrs. Gross revealed that Quint and the boy were always together. Miles sometimes lied about seeing Quint, and the extent of their relationship troubled Mrs. Gross. We delved into the children's behavior, questioning their involvement with the ghosts. I observed the children closely. They were clever and lovable, but I sensed a plan in their actions. One night, I encountered Quint's ghost on the stairs, confirming his wicked and dangerous nature. Despite the fear, I stood my ground, and he eventually disappeared. Later, I found Flora's bed empty, causing me great concern. I heard a noise, and Flora was hiding by the window. When I asked her about it, she pretended innocence and lied about seeing someone in the garden. Every night, I stayed up late, occasionally witnessing strange occurrences. Once, I saw a woman on the stairs, crying silently. On another night, I found Flora standing by the window, seemingly drawn to the ghost we saw by the lake. When questioned, she denied seeing anyone. I decided to stay up late for several nights, but after 11 days, exhaustion got the better of me, and I fell asleep early. I awoke to find Flora staring out the window at 1 a.m. She revealed that she went out to be really bad as part of a plan with Miles. He confessed to orchestrating the scheme, kissing me with an air of mischief. When I reported this to Mrs. Gross, she wondered why the children sought wickedness. Flora's actions and Miles' revelation worried me. I continued observing the children closely. The ghosts of Quint and Miss Jessel seemed to influence them toward wickedness. Despite their deaths, the ghosts still sought to take Miles and Flora. Mrs. Gross and I realized we had to stop this, and Miles' uncle needed to intervene. As the summer turned into autumn, the atmosphere grew heavy. I pondered how to communicate the truth to the children's uncle. Mrs. Gross and I agreed that he must return to help us. The changing seasons marked the approach of a storm, both literally and metaphorically. In the following weeks, the children remained silent about the ghosts, and so did I. The weight of the secret grew heavier. Eventually, a storm arrived, symbolizing the brewing turmoil. The children, still hopeful about their uncle's return, asked about their future plans. One Sunday morning, while walking to church, Miles asked about returning to school, hinting at his desire for more varied experiences. His questions and demeanor suggested a deeper understanding. A sense of unease settled as I realized that the situation was unnatural. Miles expressed a wish for more exciting things and hinted at inviting his uncle to visit. Feeling a discomforting shift, I remained outside the church for the first time, reflecting on the unfolding complexities with the children. I must leave this house. I'll go back and get ready. I can leave today. In the house, I went up to the schoolroom for my books. I opened the door, but there, sitting at my table, was that dreadful woman, Miss Jessel. She was writing, and I knew it was to her lover, Quint. Her tired face showed suffering as she used my pen and paper. When she stood up and looked at me, I screamed, calling her a wicked, terrible woman. She seemed to hear me, but the next minute, the room was empty. I realized I couldn't leave. I had to stay. Later, I spoke to Mrs. Gross about Miss Jessel. Mrs. Gross was surprised but stayed calm. Miss Jessel, she explained, was suffering and wanted Flora. I decided to write to the children's uncle and inform him about Miles' expulsion from school due to his perceived wickedness. Mrs. Gross agreed, acknowledging that something must be done. After the children's lessons the next day, Mrs. Gross asked if I had written the letter. I lied, saying yes, though the letter was still in my pocket. Later, I put it on the table by the front door, hoping a servant would find it and take it to town. In the afternoon, Miles, with a newfound freedom, offered to play music for me. Flora was nowhere to be found. When I asked Miles about her, he casually replied that he didn't know, insinuating that she might be outside somewhere. Worried, I approached Mrs. Gross and shared my concern about Flora's absence. We decided to search for her, and I explained that Miles was with Quint in the schoolroom. As we went to look for Flora, I revealed that Miles had helped her escape, leaving him free to do as he pleased. We reached the lake, suspecting that Flora had taken the boat and hidden it on the other side. Mrs. Gross and I walked around and found her standing in the grass, smiling silently. Mrs. Gross hugged her, but Flora's eerie smile remained. She asked about our outdoor clothes and mentioned Quint, perplexing us with her cryptic remarks. I want to share something important without keeping any secrets. Let me talk about mineral water. Can you please tell me where Miss Jessel is? There was a sudden scream, and at that moment, I screamed too. I grabbed Mrs. Gross's arm and said, "She's there. She's on the other side of the lake." I felt somewhat relieved, thinking it was true. Mrs. Gross would now see everything too. I pointed across the lake. Mrs. Gross looked, but Flora couldn't see anything. Mrs. Gross calmly said, "She's there, you poor child. You can see her very well." However, Mrs. Gross got angry, unable to see anyone. It felt like I was losing against the wicked governess. Mrs. Gross continued talking to Flora, insisting that Miss Jessel was not there. Flora couldn't see anyone, and Mrs. Gross claimed that poor Miss Jessel was dead, considering it all a mistake. We were going home quickly. Flora was holding onto Mrs. Gross's dress, and her face turned ugly. She couldn't see anyone, and she didn't like me. Flora asked Mrs. Gross to take her away from me. I asked, "From me? From you?" I looked at the ghost, shook my head, and sadly told Flora that I lost her. I bid her goodbye. To Mrs. Gross, I said, go at once." I don't remember anything after that. I was on the ground crying for a long time. It was almost evening when I got up, went back to the house, and up to my room. Flora's things were no longer there. Later, Miles came and sat silently with me. He wasn't unfriendly. I felt warmer when he was there. The next morning, Mrs. Gross came into my room. Flora was ill. I asked Mrs. Gross what Flora had seen. Mrs. Gross sadly said Flora seemed so old now and didn't talk about Miss Jessel at all. Flora would never speak to me again, and she would tell her uncle about me. Mrs. Gross asked if she should leave. I agreed, saying that's what Flora wanted. She didn't want to see me again. I told her to go and take Flora to her uncle's. I would stay with Miles, but the two children shouldn't be alone together for 3 seconds. Flora had to leave the house, and we would go that morning. I couldn't stay. Flora was saying terrible things, dreadful words. She was crying, and Mrs. Gross asked if I believed her. I did. I needed to take Flora far away. Her letter would arrive in town first, I said. Mrs. Gross disagreed, saying it disappeared from the table by the front door. Miles took it. I was determined to talk to him and save him. The servants were surprised when Flora left with Mrs. Gross, and Miles didn't seem worried. We had lunch together in the large dining room. Miles asked about Flora's health, and I told him she would get better in London. He filled his plate, and we ate quickly. Miles got up, stared with his back to me and his hands in his pockets. We didn't speak while the servant took the plates away. Miles said, "We're alone now." I agreed, saying Flora must leave the house. We would go that morning because Flora was saying terrible things, dreadful words, and I wondered where she learned them. She believed me now, and I asked her about my letter. She said it disappeared, and Miles took it. He was a thief, stealing letters at school. I walked with Miles everywhere, and he liked it. I asked if he liked being more alone, and he said it didn't matter. I expressed happiness to be there and wondered why I was still there. He said it was for me, as I was his friend, and he wanted to help me. He recalled that night in my bedroom, and I asked if he remembered. He said yes, but noted that I wanted something from him too. I confirmed, asking him to tell me everything. He questioned if I stayed to hear everything from him. I asked if it was a good time or if he wanted to go out again. He wanted to go out, picked up his hat, and was ready to leave. I asked one thing before he went: "Did you take my letter from the table by the door?" The room changed, and everything felt bad. Miles saw nothing. He admitted taking the letter, and I held him in my arms. The ghostly face stared at us through the glass, and I asked why he took it. He said he wanted me to know what I wrote about him. I asked if he opened the letter, and he confirmed, saying he burned it. I questioned if he did similar things at school, stealing and burning letters. He asked if he stole other things. His voice indicated it was a terrible question. I asked why he couldn't go back, and he replied that he said things to a few people, and the masters heard about it. It was all. I questioned what things, and he didn't say. The face at the window came closer, and it wanted to stop Miles from revealing the truth. I screamed, holding Miles, and shouted to the ghost, "No more." Miles saw nothing, and I realized I was holding a dead child on a quiet afternoon.